I'm very much taken with the idea of a very pragmatic approach to human rights. What do human rights, the notion of human rights, do? And what do they do for us? And how does it inform the way we think about public policy? And that's not to rule out the foundation's question, but it is to put it to the side. And Michael Ignatieff's book and essay called The Idolatry of Human Rights is very, very helpful in making this point. It's a very simple point. And the point is we can get agreement on, again, going back to the experience of the 20th century. The 20th century was a century of mass murder. It was a century of genocide. It was a century of human rights disasters. And what Michael says in this article, in this book and this article, is that just from a pragmatic point of view, we can agree that when human rights are not only violated but put to the side in such a crass way, in such a monumental way, we see the results of it. And that so we don't have to agree on the foundations. We can agree on the history.
What about the other side of that? What about duties and responsibilities? How does that become part of our discussion of human rights?
Well, again, it plays in at many different levels. It comes on at the individual level in terms of what one owes one's community, one's society.
From the simplest point
nation.
of taxes or
Absolutely.
service?
Participation. And the only thing I would just flag here is the complicated nature of that. Again, it's not just being a citizen. It's being a professional. It's being a member of a religious community. It's being a member of an activist community. It's being, we all have multiple roles that we play in the world. And I think it's important to have some reflection on what those roles are and what the responsibilities are within those contexts.
Let's talk about the third pillar of ethics, which is fairness.
Right.
How would you define fairness?
Well, fairness is probably the most slippery and difficult because of the varieties of ways to interpret it. And it is in itself an interpretive exercise, what is fair. But I would begin with, again, going back to this notion that there are certain, I guess called the moral sentiments that we all share as humans and that we recognize. And there's something deep within us that I'm going to just call fairness. And again, I'm not suggesting that you and I even share the same result of what that is, but we do share this notion of fairness. There's something called fairness, in that we would recognize something that's deeply unfair to us, and so on. So anyway, it's built on that stipulation that built into the human condition and the human nature is an idea of fairness, just as we would have an idea of shame, or just as we would have an idea of fear, or there are certain kind of sentiments that we would recognize as being human, and that I'm going to suggest that fairness is a very important one, and it has great importance in terms of how we think about ethics and how we think about public policy. Probably the most famous contemporary philosopher to deal with this question is John Rawls. Justice is fairness. And his famous, perhaps the place to start is his famous experiment, referred to as the veil of ignorance. It's a very simple exercise. If we just imagine ourselves setting the rules for our society, and we all come to the table, but we don't know what our standing in society will be. So we don't know if we're rich or we're poor. Perhaps we're handicapped in some way, and so on. So we're totally disinterested. We just say, what do we think the fair rules would be to set up this system, this community, this society? And we sort of go through this exercise. And this is the idea of coming up with, well, what would be fair in a disinterested way? So this is a very powerful way to begin to think about fairness.